We all know the rules for 2.4 GHz. There are only 3 usable non-overlapping channels in North America. 1, 6, and 11. That has been drilled into any network engineer who spent more than 5 minutes optimizing a 2.4 GHz network. But here's the thing, a lot of people don't realize that 5 GHz is even more particular. There are more channels, more power rules, more regulatory restrictions, and way more ways to quietly sabotage your own network without even knowing it. The biggest culprit? Leaving everything on auto. Today we're breaking down what you should actually be setting for transmit power, channel width, channel selection, and we're using Unify as an example, but everything here applies equally to other network systems, such as TP-Link. Most people deploy access points, leave the power on auto, leave the channels on auto, and call it a day. And honestly, for a small AP in a small apartment, it works fine. But the moment you have more than one AP, nearby neighbors, or really any RF interference, auto starts making decisions you really don't want it to make. Here's what auto actually does. Unify's auto transmit power will often ramp APs up to their maximum output, sometimes between 23 to 30 dBm on 5 GHz. They're trying to ensure coverage, and on that surface that sounds great. More power equals more range, right? That's where things usually go wrong. When your AP is blasting at full power, it creates a massive coverage cell, and clients on the far edge of that cell are holding on to a weaker, noisier signal instead of roaming to a closer AP. Your phone thinks it's still connected, and technically it is, but device throughput tanks. Now here's why. Wi-Fi is a two-way communication. APs can transmit at a much higher power level than client devices, like phones can, so while your phone might be able to hear the AP just fine, the AP may struggle to hear the phone back. The result is an asymmetric link. The AP is shouting across the room, but the phone is speaking quietly in the corner. More power doesn't fix that, it makes it worse. Now the AP is also drowning out neighboring equipment and making it harder for any device in the area to share the channel cleanly, leading to packet retries and waiting on other systems to finish talking. There's also a hardware effect worth understanding. Just like turning a speaker to full volume can cause audible distortions, Wi-Fi access points can exhibit similar behavior outputting at maximum power. When a radio is pushed to its limits, the power amplifier can saturate, producing non-linear distortion that degrades signal quality. You might see full bars, but actually throughput can be significantly lower than you expect. For this reason, it's generally recommended to run APs at 3 to 6 decibels below the maximum rated power. This is a point we'll come back to in the transmitter power section. Auto channel selection has a similar problem. It picks channels at start time or on a schedule, and it doesn't always stay consistent across reboots or firmware updates. You can end with APs on overlapping channels or on channels that restrict your variable power output. Unify's AI channel optimizer does improve on basic auto in most cases. However, it still has some critical issues. An example of these issues is that it can assign higher power channels, for example channel 149, to APs that don't need them, while giving lower power channels, for example channel 36, to APs that do. This brings us to the 5 GHz channel map. Note that while this chart doesn't perfectly reflect current Canadian regulations, it does match the rules that Unify and most other APs are currently applying in Canada. We'll explain as we go. So UNII 1, these are the long, safe, and compatible 5 GHz channels. In Canada, standard unlicensed devices are limited by spectrum policy and certification requirements to indoor use only with a maximum of 200 milliwatts EIRP. This is why systems like Unify may limit your power options on these channels. There is, however, a professional level option worth knowing about. ECCC offers something called an R1 spectrum license, specifically for higher power and outdoor RLAN devices. In the 5150 to 5250 MHz band, with this license you can run up to 1 watt of conductive power with a 6 dBi antenna, which works out to about a maximum of 4 watts EIRP, and you're permitted to do so both indoors and outdoors. A few important caveats. The R1 license is available only to businesses and government organizations. Personal use is explicitly excluded from the eligibility rules. It requires an annual renewal application and coordination with licensed earth station operators if you're deploying within 25 kilometers of one. If all that applies to your situation, it can be useful for UNII 1, but it's not something a home user can access. UNII 2 and UNII Extended, these channels here, these bands both require DFS, dynamic frequency selection, before an AP can transmit on a DFS channel. It must perform a channel availability check, CIC, or a passive scan lasting at least 60 seconds to confirm no radar system has used that frequency. If radar is however detected during normal operations on that channel, the AP must vacate that channel within 10 seconds and cannot return to that channel for 30 minutes. Not ideal during a VoIP call or gaming session, since they will have to realistically switch to 2.4 GHz when that happens. One practical advantage worth knowing about is most ISP-provided residential gateways, Bell Home Hubs, Rogers gateways, and similar equipment, deliberately avoid DFS channels entirely. The 60-second startup time and the channel switching and downtime after a radar hit is simply too difficult to explain to residential customers. So ISP firmware is almost universally locked to UNI 1 and UNI 3. The result is that dense residential environments, like apartment buildings, DFS channels are often the least congested 5 GHz spectrum available. If you're running gear that handles DFS properly, accepting the 60-second startup delay in exchange for operating on a channel with essentially no neighbors can be a worthwhile trade-off, particularly on channels 100 to 116 and 132 to 144, which tend to see the least ISP traffic. One thing to note is that DFS might seem scary and that choosing a DFS channel could lead to frequent outages. It's not as bad as it would seem. Unify logs every radar detection event in the event logs, and at CyberBadger, we manage a large variety of sites and have rarely seen a DFS radar report show up before. Now here's something a lot of people don't know, and it's recent news. You may have heard that channels 120, 124, and 128 in Canada were reserved for Environmental Canada's C-band weather radar operation in the 5,600 to 5,650 MHz range. That restriction was real and serious, and CIC for those channels required a full 10 minutes rather than 60 seconds, but that restriction is no longer in effect. ISED released the RSS-247 Issue 4 in July 2025, and one of the headline changes was the complete removal of the 5600 to 5650 restriction, officially aligning Canada with FCC rules in the United States. Why is the change? Because radar is gone. Between 2017 and 2023, Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, replaced its entire aging C-band weather radar network. The project deployed 33 new S-band dual-polarization radar systems operating at 2.7 to 2.9 GHz, completely different spectrum. Once the last C-band radar was decommissioned, the justification for protecting the 5,600 to 5,650 MHz band simply ceased to exist. The ISED removed the restriction accordingly. The catch: even though channels 120, 124, and 128 are now legally permitted in Canada under RSS-247 Issue 4, Ubiquiti has not yet updated their firmware to reflect this. As of 2026, Unify's APs in Canada regulatory domain are still blocking these channels. The law has changed, the radar is gone, the hardware is capable, but Ubiquiti hasn't flipped the switch, so hopefully that does change soon. UNI Channel 3 is channels 149 to 165. That's in the spectrum listed right around here. This is great for indoor and outdoor use, with up to 1 watt conductive power and 4 watt EIRP maximum, no DFS required. These are generally your best performing 5 GHz channels. It's predictable, stable, and completely outside the DFS range. The takeaway: manually pin your APs to appropriate channels, and if you want to use DFS channels for additional capacity, use them intentionally. Understand the trade-offs, and ideally don't put them where critical Wi-Fi equipment could be connected to them. However, that equipment should be hardwired if possible anyways. Finally, UNII 4, the new frontier. Before we move on, it's worth briefly mentioning that 5 GHz band doesn't end at channel 165. There's a band called UNII 4 covering 5,850 MHz to 5,895 MHz. Channels 169 through 177. Nice. ISED has opened this band for Wi-Fi under RS-247 Issue 4, but with strict conditions that are worth understanding. Outdoor use is limited to fixed infrastructure only, fixed APs and fixed client devices. No mobile roaming devices outside. Indoor APs in this band must be wired, no battery power, must have permanent antenna, must not have a weatherized enclosure, and must have a direct internet connection. The standard also defines a separate subordinate device category. This is something that some specific wireless node systems can operate a wireless backhaul on this frequency. In practice, these constraints effectively limit UNI-4 to enterprise infrastructure deployments. Only a handful of APs support it all, and very few client devices have radios that can turn to these frequencies. 5 GHz supports 20, 40, 80, and 160 MHz channel widths. Now, 80 MHz is really the sweet spot. 160 MHz channel eats up almost the entire usable 5 GHz band historically. However, with the release of channels 120 to 128, another 160 MHz band will be released across the systems eventually. If you have more than 2 APs, they will have heavy channel overlap and cause similar issues to 2.4 GHz. Throughput might look impressive in a speed test against one AP, but a real-world performance in a multi-AP environment will be worse than 80 MHz. Stick with 80 MHz unless you have a very specific, intentional reason to go wider. Lower power and more APs. Now it's worth noting the term used to be WAPs, W-A-P. However, a certain musician changed that term to mean something else, so we'll stick with APs for now. Lower power and more APs is equal to better performance and better roaming. This is the single most important mindset shift in Wi-Fi design. Here are the recommended starting points. 2.4 GHz set to about 8 to 10 decibel meters. Typically set this to low for ubiquity preset. For 5 GHz, 15 to 20 decibel meters is a safe spot to be, around medium. And for 6 GHz, 17 to 20 decibel meters is around medium to high. The goal here is a symmetric clean link. Your phone's radio simply cannot transmit at the same power level as your AP. If the AP is too loud, the link becomes asymmetric. The client can hear the AP, but the AP can barely hear the client back. You get all the symptoms of a bad connection, while the phone cheerfully shows full signal bars. Note that a directional antenna or a high-quality AP, such as an E7 or E7 campus, will hear the same client from farther away. They still fundamentally run into the same issues eventually. Target around minus 65 to minus 70 dBm minimum signal strength at the client when it's around the edge of a cell for the best signal balance of throughput and reliability. Note that the higher the power output from an AP, the less likely the client will roam when it's supposed to, and will lead to the client being very sticky. And remember the distortion point from earlier. Running below maximum power isn't just about range control. It keeps your radios in its linear operation range, where the signal quality is actually better. Wired backhaul is almost always the right answer. Every wireless hop in a mesh system cuts into your available throughput, especially if the nodes are positioned at a distance. Beyond the throughput mesh systems can be black boxes, with some not even allowing you to manually set channels, widths, or power levels, which makes interference very hard to diagnose. If you're adding coverage and running cable is an option, run the cable. You'll save a lot of time and hassle, and it'll just be a better experience overall. Wi-Fi 6E and Wi-Fi 7 and the release of 6 GHz was genuinely exciting. You get up to 1,200 MHz of fresh, clear spectrum with no legacy devices, no DFS radar complications, and dramatically lower congestion. But there's a catch. AFC, Automated Frequency Coordination. In Canada and the US, 6 GHz outdoor and high power indoor requires AFC. Your AP checks in with a central database to confirm its authorization to transmit at a given channel and at a given location. As of 2026, the system is officially live. The problem is that many APs don't fully support AFC. Without it, these APs are locked to low power indoor mode, LPI, which leads to limited output, limited range, and no outdoor use. This can lead to situations where if the AP density isn't high enough, having 6 GHz enabled can cause serious issues if clients don't move to 5 GHz when the signal is too weak. AFC also introduces different kind of fragility. Your AP's authorization on a given channel can technically change between check-ins. It's a rare case, but if you're evaluating a 6 GHz capable AP right now, APC should be on your checklist, along with whether the manufacturer is actively pushing AFC updates. Note that over half of UNFI's 6 GHz APs don't actually support AFC currently. Only the E7, E7 Campus, E7 Audience, and the E7 Pro Outdoor do currently. Now to quickly summarize. For 2.4 GHz channels 1, 6, and 11 only, set power to low. For 5 GHz, 60 UNI-1 for short-range indoor applications, and UNI-3 for longer-range outdoor applications. Power set to medium. Use DFS if you need the extra coverage or higher density, but do note the drawbacks. UNI 1 power, 200 milliwatt EIRP for standard unlicensed indoor use with up to 4 watt EIRP with an R1 spectrum license. Business and government only. Personal use is ineligible. DFS channels are usable, but come with a 60-second startup delay and a 30-minute recovery period after radio detection event. Channels 120 to 128 are now legally permitted in Canada under RSS-247 Issue 4, but Ubiquiti and other firmware still blocks them as of 2026. UNI 4, channels 169 to 177, is officially open in Canada. However, ecosystem support is still limited. 6 GHz. Medium to high power, 17 to 21 dBm. Verify AFC before you buy. Consider turning off if AFC isn't supported and high density isn't possible. Auto is not your friend. It often fails to optimize for coverage and connection quality. If you found this interesting, feel free to check out our website, link below, or leave a comment.